The 1960s were a time of change and conflicting points of view. One of the most important movements of the decade was the Civil Rights Movement, which took place during a polarizing time in our nation's history. People on both sides of the issue justified their stances with their religious views. This is what I would like to examine as I ask the question, how did religion influence the Civil Rights Movement? According to Statistica.com, the majority of people in the 1960s identified as Protestants. Their numbers indicate the percentage to be in the high 60s. This is a sharp contrast to what they estimate today, with the percentage of self-identifying Protestants more than halved. So remember that the religious climate of the 1960s was different than it is today. It just so happens that nearly everyone that we will be discussing in this video would be most closely identified as some type of Protestant. The Civil Rights Movement centered around the idea that people of all ethnic backgrounds should be treated equally and be afforded the same opportunities as people of other ethnicities. Segregation, for example, was one of the ideas that this movement fought against. The most prominent anti-segregationalist of this era was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A highly religious man, King was a pastor in a long line of pastors dating back to his great-grandfather. He put it this way.
I grew up in the church. I'm the son of a preacher. I'm the great-grandson of a preacher. And the great-great-grandson of a preacher. My father is a preacher. My grandfather was a preacher. My great-grandfather was a preacher. My only brother is a preacher. My daddy's brother is a preacher. So I didn't have much choice, I guess.
King's religious beliefs brought forth three ideas that helped to shape the Civil Rights Movement. First, King was a huge advocate of peaceful protests. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, he wrote, "Occasionally in life, one develops a conviction so precious and meaningful that he will stand on it till the end. This is what I have found in nonviolence." King was of the school of thought that nonviolence was a natural outworking of Christianity. King said this in a speech shortly after Rosa Parks was arrested for not giving up a seat to a Caucasian person.
We believe in the Christian religion. We believe in the teachings of Jesus. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest.
The peacefulness of King's movement, despite the difficulties which that approach brought, eventually proved to be effective. On May 3, 1963, the Commissioner of Public Safety for the city of Birmingham, Alabama, Bull Connor, ordered the fire hoses to be turned on teenage protesters of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. One historian described it this way. Streams of water with enough pressure to strip bark off trees knocked school children off their feet and sent them into brick walls. Eventually, sites like this and others began to be covered by news outlets. Households throughout the nation would see unarmed African Americans being attacked without a justifiable reason. Having these kinds of graphic reports eventually swayed public opinion in favor of the integration movement. The other two ideas that King's beliefs brought about were his involvement in and his stance on the issue of segregation. Certainly, he felt that God would be in favor of an anti-segregation position. He said this in April of 1967.
We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred head of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands.
It would be one thing to have a stance on an issue, but King also felt it was his duty, and everyone else's, to be greatly involved in such a movement. He once said, "We have a duty to ourselves for our self-respect and before the Almighty God to stand up for our freedom." So, MLK's beliefs led him to peacefully protest segregation. What is interesting is that other Christian leaders felt very differently about the issues of political involvement regarding segregation. This view was most common among conservative evangelicals. Let me give you a few examples. During the time of the Selma marches in 1965, evangelical preacher Jerry Falwell preached a notable sermon in front of about 1,000 people in Lynchburg, Virginia. I found out about this sermon by reading two books by Matthew Avery Sutton. I'd like to look at a few ideas from this sermon by Falwell. Please note as we begin, some of these views expressed in this sermon were later renounced by Falwell. The main idea that was examined was, and I quote, "Does the church have any command from God to involve itself in marches, demonstrations, or any other actions such as many ministers and church leaders are doing so today in the name of civil rights reforms?" End quote. His answer to this would be no. After presenting his opening idea and saying that some in the civil rights movement are sincere, Falwell said this: "At the same time, I must personally say that I do question the sincerity and nonviolent intentions of some civil rights leaders such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. James Farmer, and others, who are known to have left-wing associations. It is very obvious that the communists, as they do in all parts of the world, are taking advantage of a tense situation in our land and are exploiting every incident to bring about violence and bloodshed." Falwell would go on to say that nowhere are we commissioned to reform the externals, but emphasize that religious conversion was the only fitting approach to society's problems. It's clear from a reading of the text of the sermon that Falwell was against the idea of political involvement, and this contrast between his views and King's is what I found most interesting while studying the subject. It is also interesting to note that despite being against political involvement in the 1960s, Falwell would go on to be one of the most politically involved evangelicals of his era. Here's a photo of him with President Reagan. Falwell wasn't alone in thinking this way, as others who were prominent in the religious community held similar views. Carl McIntyre wrote a letter to President Johnson to protest the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and more. He wrote to the president, "It is my firm belief that what this nation needs is not federal legislation such as you are asking, but our people need to be brought face to face with the demands of the eternal law of God as set forth in your mother's Bible." Commenting on this civil rights bill, Falwell said, "It should be considered civil wrongs rather than civil rights," due to his belief that the bill violated human and private property rights. In conclusion, King's beliefs motivated him to advocate for civil rights, while on the other hand, many conservative voices within evangelicalism were against legislation for civil rights or against being involved in the movement in hopes that conversion would solve injustices in society. So then, we might conclude that religion's role in the civil rights movement was both helpful and harmful as it influenced its proponents and opponents. Thanks for watching.